Google search GMATPoint daily targets, click on the first link. Here, you can take short GMAT tests for free in an exam interface. After submitting your test, you can view detailed video solutions. These tests are taken by thousands of students worldwide. Start your preparation by taking these tests today.
Hi friends, welcome to GMATPoint's videos. In this particular video, I'll give you a brief overview of the reading comprehension questions that come in the GMAT exam. Much of the GMAT exam has reading comprehension. It's a very important part of the GMAT exam, and knowing how the questions are, what the format is very important before you actually give the exam. It helps you mentally prepare for that. So this particular video will just give you an overview of what kind of questions come, what is expected of the student, and what kind of formats come as such. So let's take a look at the RCs, type of RC that come. So you might get a short RC, which is basically something which is 200 to 250 words, so a small RC as such, or you can get a longer RC which is like 300 to 400 words, 350 to 400 words. So basically when you have a short RC, you have fewer questions, like 2 questions or 3 questions, and when you have a longer RC, you have 3 to 4 questions. Ultimately, overall, what you will be asked is somewhere around 13 to 14 questions. So this 13 to 14 questions, and how many you are exactly asked depends on how well you are doing. So if you are doing very well, you might get 14 questions. If you are not doing that well, you might get a smaller or a shorter paragraph with fewer questions. Again, just because you have gotten a shorter paragraph, it doesn't mean that you have done poorly. So you should not actually go in with any kind of preconceived notions that you have to have, or you have to solve 14 questions or 13 questions is a bad distribution to get. Also, there's nothing like this. It might be that a particular RC set is tougher, some RC set is easier, even if it has more questions or lesser questions as such. So just remember that you will get around 13 to 14 questions, and this configuration can be either 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, where one of these 3 question sets is a shorter set, or you can get something which is like 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 4, which is essentially around 13 questions, or you can get something like 3 plus 3 plus 4 plus 4, which is 14 questions. So in this kind of a scenario, basically you will be having a mix of shorter paragraphs, shorter 3 question paragraphs, and longer paragraphs also. So in these kind of sets, basically what you have to remember is that the length of the set is not necessarily the factor that is going to determine the difficulty of the set. That what is being tested is your reading comprehension skills, and certain sets can be harder to comprehend, harder to understand, and harder to digest, even if they are shorter. So a philosophical RC might actually be harder even with 250 words. A more commonplace RC where you have passages from things that you normally experience, that might be on the easier side. So the length of the RC is not a proxy for its difficulty, and the number of questions asked also is not necessarily a proxy for how you are doing in that exam. So do not actually make that a factor into how you actually go on to attempt the exam. In this case, you just have to remember that you have to deal with something like 13 to 14 questions and how to deal with them. The shorter RCs, as I said, would be 200 to 250 words. If you have like one paragraph which is like a very short RC of 200 words, you will get 2 questions, because the length of the paragraph is somehow correlated with the number of questions you can ask from it. If you get 2 paragraphs which is around 250 words, you can get 3 questions from it. On the other hand, if you get something which is around 300 to 400 words, again you can be asked somewhere between 3 to 4 questions on it. Now, this should determine how much time you spend. Remember that if you get a shorter paragraph, you should be spending lesser time on it. So roughly, basically, you should try to follow the rule of using twice 2x times the minutes as the passage, as the number of questions. So if it's a 2 question passage, then you should spend 4 minutes on it. If it's a 3 question passage, you should spend somewhere around 5 to 6 minutes on it. So if it's a 2 question passage, basically spend 2 minutes on reading the passage and 1 minute per question. Basically, more time should be spent on understanding the passage, having a good hold on the passage, and then moving on to the questions. What I would not recommend is reading the passage or skimming through the passage and directly going to the questions, because generally that causes confusion, and that also is the reason why sometimes many students have to read and reread a particular passage. That should not be the case. You should read and understand the passage in one go, and then you should be ready for the questions that come without having to think too much about what you just read. Okay, so I would suggest the ideal combination, that is that spend 2 minutes on the passage and 1 minute per question. If you have a shorter passage with 3 questions also. Spend 2 minutes on the passage because it is still 250 words. You do not need 3 minutes for it, and 1 minute per question, which adds up to like 5 minutes. If you get a longer passage, you will take more time to actually read the passage. So if it's like around 300 words, 350 words, you will need 3 minutes for it. If it's 400 words, you will roughly need 4 minutes for reading that. And try to maintain time taken per question to 1 minute per question. So spend some amount of time reading and understanding the passage, and then spend 1 minute per question. Now, when I say spend time reading and understanding the passage, what you should ideally do is, and you're given a note pad to write. So whenever you're reading, for every paragraph you read, write down the main point of that paragraph. It need not be grammatically correct, it need not be perfect, but that the exercise of writing down the main point of that paragraph essentially forces you to encapsulate what you have read. It forces you to reflect on what you have read, so you do not read without registering. That is what a lot of students actually do, where they skim through the passage or skim through the paragraphs and nothing really registers. So when you're forcing yourself to write down what you have just read, write down the main point of what you have read, it kind of encapsulates, it forces you to register what has happened, what you have just read. You need not write the details of what you have read, you just basically need to write one line main point of what you have read. So if you read about a scientific experiment and its results and its key findings, basically you would just give the first one line saying the experiment setup and what it seeks to prove or disprove, and the observations that the experiment had, and what are the conclusions. You need not go into the details of how the experiment was conducted, what are the drawbacks of the results, or what are the issues with the results. You need not actually consider yourself with the nitty-gritties of the passage. You just need to pick the single main point that is actually being made as such. So now that you understand the approach to your reading comprehension, how much time you should spend on it, let us try to take a look at the type of questions that are asked there. Now, it's important to know that you do not get direct questions from reading comprehensions. You will not be asked that, okay, if this is a historical RC or based on a historical passage, it won't be asked that who did he meet, who did X meet in this place. That kind of direct questions are not asked. What is generally asked is questions where you're required to reflect on the passage, think about the passage, think about the writing, the message that was sent, think or evaluate the reasoning that the author has used, understand the flaws in the reasoning. So most of it is evaluative in nature, as in you don't just read, but you evaluate what you have read. You try to understand the gist of what you have read, and then you evaluate whether what the author has written makes sense or not. What is the attitude of the author? What is the tone of the author? What is the reasoning employed by the author? What is implicit or what are the assumptions made by the author? So it's not this reading comprehension isn't something where you just read and know the details, memorize the details and find out and mark those details in the questions. Not at all. In fact, the details are not as important as the overarching message of that passage. So always remember, the questions that are asked are subjective in nature. They require you to reflect on the questions, to understand the passage, what the author has said and what he has left unsaid, what the author has implied, what can be inferred, what the author would agree with, what the author would not agree with, what the author's style and tone in the passage has been. So a lot of it is not obvious. A lot of it is basically reading between the lines. So let us take a look at the types of questions that are generally asked. So the first most common type of question that is asked is about the main idea. So the main idea is basically you will be asked that which of the following represents the primary purpose behind writing this passage. So here you are asked to reflect on why did the author actually write this. So is he trying to convince you about something? Is the author trying to explain certain things? Is the author trying to analyze a particular situation? What was the motivating factor behind writing this particular paragraph? And you can also be asked that what is the central idea of the passage? What is the main point of the passage? You will be asked what is the conclusions that the author has reached at the end of his analysis as such. So here you are basically being asked as for the overarching method of the passage. To answer these kind of questions, you need to understand the passage as a whole. It's not that you should understand parts of the passage, but the whole entirety of the passage. When you see a passage as a whole, you will be able to answer questions of this type. Now the second part of it is basically a sub part of it, where you, instead of being asked for the main idea, you are asked for the supporting ideas. Supporting ideas basically means that you will be asked that this particular example has been given in passage 2 to explain what. So basically, before you are making a large overarching message, you might have smaller messages to give or smaller conclusions that you arrive at. Now, such of these smaller conclusions, you might give examples to make those conclusions, you might give evidence to make those conclusions, research to support the conclusions. So suppose your overarching goal is that you believe that, for example, if you believe that the SATs are a poor form of testing aptitude or testing suitability for college. So if that is your overarching goal, you might give might have smaller ideas to suggest that for example, you can say that they support a more unequal distribution of opportunities for college for students. So that might be one of the points that you're making. So a particular paragraph of your overall passage might be supporting that particular idea. So this is a supporting idea that is part of the overarching message that essentially supports the overarching message. But if you are asked, okay, of this particular example or of this particular paragraph, what is the main point being made through that paragraph, or what is the author trying to convey through this example, then you have to look at the smaller idea that is being represented and not the overarching idea as such. So this is the second type of question that is asked, basically the overarching message or the smaller messages through the different parts of the paragraph. Now let us take a look at the third type of question that is being asked, that is of inferences. Now a lot of what is said in the passage, there will be explicit conclusions that the author arrives at. There will be very clear arguments that the author makes. But many times when people write, a lot of things are implied but never explicitly stated. For example, if you are reading a opinion piece about how a particular policy is not a good policy, the author might not actually come out and say that this policy is terrible. Such kind of extreme wording is almost never used by many authors as such. But what the author will do is that the author will keep poking holes in the policy, saying that this policy will lead to these bad conclusions, this policy will harm us in this particular way. So essentially the author will just paint a negative picture of the policy without explicitly stating that this policy is terrible. So a lot of these passages will have these implicit conclusions that are not stated in the passage that you can infer based on the information given in the passage. So a lot of questions that come from this is basically what can be inferred from this particular paragraph, what can be inferred about the policy, or the author has implied, what does the author imply through this particular example about the policy. So a lot of inferences can be drawn through these passages, and that makes the third type of common question that comes in GMAT reading comprehension. The fourth type of question that comes is that of application. So what is application? Application is basically you are asked for things where you take what is given in the passage and you apply it to something which is outside of the passage. So for example, which of the following would be a good example of the arguments made by the author against a particular policy? Or if you say that the passage is about, say, the imposter syndrome. So the passage is entirely about the imposter syndrome, and then the author will say which of the following examples or which of the following options represents a case of the imposter syndrome. So now that option will not actually be in the passage, but it would use the same logic or reasoning as is seen in the passage. So after reading the passage, you should say that, okay, this particular option matches up in logic or in the pattern that I have observed in the passage. So here basically you have to evaluate external information in light of what you have read in the passage. So by default, everything that is there in these kind of questions is out of scope of the actual passage. It would be basically things that are extra information, extra examples, facts that might change the argument for or against. So you can be asked that which of the following would actually cast serious doubt on the arguments made by, on the conclusion reached by the author. So this is extra information that would weaken the author's arguments. Or you can say which of the following study supports the author's arguments. So all of this basically is extra information that can either strengthen, weaken, or act on whatever the author is saying through the passage, or can be an example or evidence of what the author is saying through the passage. So this is basically taking and understanding what is given in the passage and applying it to external information. Okay, now let's take a look at the fifth type of question that comes in your reading comprehension, that is evaluation. So here you now have to become a critic. In evaluation questions, you have to not just accept what the author has said, but critically evaluate what the author has said. So you have to now identify the flaws in the reasoning or the arguments that the author has made. You have to evaluate what are the assumptions that the author has made. You have to understand what would actually strengthen the author's case, what would weaken the author's case. So here you are essentially using critical reasoning skills to evaluate the author's arguments. You are essentially putting on a critic's hat and seeing the passage with a critical eye, not just accepting that the author has said this, okay, the author has said this policy is terrible, not just accepting it at face value, but thinking, is the author right in making that kind of a call? So here you have to evaluate whether the author has made the has any gaps in his thinking, has made any mistakes in his thinking, or even if the author's arguments are right, why they are right. What do you think would actually strengthen those kind of arguments? So all of this is basically evaluative, and you are looking at the passage with a critical external eye. As such, you are not accepting whatever is given in the passage at face value. Now the last type of question that comes is based on style and tone. Now these are essentially understanding these context or the essentially syntax of the passage. You will be now looking at the word choices that the author has made. Has the author made very harsh word choices? So if the author has made particularly disparaging remarks about the say the policy or whatever the author is discussing, you can say that the tone of the author is very harsh, it is sarcastic, it is sardonic, the author is being very caustic in his taking down of this policy. So here you have to not just understand what the author is saying, but how he is saying it. Is the author being guarded, or is the author being moderate in his either praise or criticism, or the author is being unguarded in his criticism, or the author is being unguarded in his place. So you have to understand the style and the tone of the author also. So here instead of just looking at what the author has said, you have to look at how the author has said it. What are the word choices the author has made? What are the argument techniques the author has made? So if the author is arguing for something by using logic or reasoning, then you can say that the particular passage has a persuasive style or an analytical style. Now, if the author has used say reasoning or logic while explaining his stand, then you can say that the passage is analytical in its style. On the other hand, if the author has used hyperbole, or if the author has been unnecessarily critical, then you can say the author has been subjective. The author has not had the objective balance while reviewing this particular policy. See, here you are now looking at how the particular passage has been written. So now that you understand, if you take a look at all the six, this main idea, supporting idea, inferences, application, evaluation, and style and tone, you're essentially looking at not just the passage, but beyond the passage. What the author says, how does he say it, why does he say it, what can be inferred from what the author has said, how it can be applied to external information and examples, and evaluate how well the author has made the point that he has made. So here basically you have to just remember that in reading comprehension, you have to evaluate the passage not just from the perspective of the information given in the passage, but basically on how it is written, what can be inferred. Essentially, you have to spend more time reading between the lines than the lines itself. Okay, so with that I will end this video. Just remember, this is basically getting you introduced to the idea of reading comprehension. We will be going through all the parts of reading comprehension one by one. So thank you for tuning in.